The sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, illuminating the stack of unwashed dishes in the sink. Emily sighed as she stared at the overflowing basin. Another day, another thing on the endless to-do list. It wasn't that she couldn't wash the dishes herself. It was the clogged sink that had rendered her efforts futile. She tried to run the water, but it pooled immediately, swirling into a murky mess. "Stupid sink," she muttered, her frustration echoing in the empty kitchen. She glanced at her phone on the counter, contemplating whether to text Adam. She knew he'd brush it off, too busy with work meetings to care about something so trivial. He'd been that way for years, distant, perpetually engrossed in his career and oblivious to the growing chasm between them. Emily put the phone down without calling him. What would be the point? He'd probably send her a dismissive, "I'll handle it later," before forgetting entirely. This was her life now. A neat suburban home, a husband always out of reach, and a heart that ached with loneliness. Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar buzz of a text. She glanced at her phone. It was from Adam. "Plumber will be there at 3. Don't forget to be home. Need to run." No greeting, no inquiry into her day, just instructions. Emily rolled her eyes, setting the phone back down harder than she intended. She opened the fridge and stared at its contents, her appetite absent despite the perfectly arranged leftovers. Something about Adam's curt message stung more than usual. There wasn't just the words. There was the reminder of how transactional their relationship had become. He used to leave sweet notes on the counter. He used to kiss her goodbye before he left for work. Now, they were little more than roommates. At exactly 3:15, there was a knock at the door. Emily wiped her hands on her jeans, rushing to open it. She expected the usual, an older man in a stained jumpsuit, carrying a toolbox and grumbling about his day. But when she swung the door open, she froze. The man standing on her porch wasn't what she expected at all. He was young, mid-30s maybe, with dark, tousled hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it moments before. His eyes were a striking hazel, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He wore a fitted black t-shirt that hugged his broad shoulders and jeans that hung just right. He carried a tool bag in one hand, a confident smirk on his face. "Hi," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "You must be Emily. I'm Jake, the plumber." Emily blinked, realizing she'd been staring too long. "Oh, yeah, come in, the sink. It's in the kitchen." She stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. She hadn't bothered to dress up today, just an old tank top and a pair of denim shorts. As Jake walked past her, she caught a whiff of his cologne, clean, with a hint of something woody, and immediately wished she'd done more to prepare. Jake set his tool bag on the counter, surveying the clogged sink with a practiced eye. "Looks pretty bad," he said, crouching down to inspect the pipes. "How long's it been like this?" "Just a few days," Emily replied, standing awkwardly nearby. She crossed her arms over her chest, feeling suddenly exposed under his gaze, even though he wasn't looking at her. Jake turned to her, his smile easy. "Don't worry, I've seen worse. Shouldn't take too long to fix." Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. She found herself watching him as he worked, the way his hands moved with confident precision, the way his shirt stretched across his back when he leaned under the sink. She shook her head, forcing herself to look away. What was wrong with her? He was just a plumber, here to fix a clogged sink. "You don't get many calls like this, I bet," she said, trying to fill the silence. "Suburban moms with broken sinks." Jake laughed, his voice warm and inviting. "You'd be surprised. Suburban homes keep me busy. Something's always breaking." He looked over his shoulder at her, his hazel eyes glinting with amusement. "Besides, it beats crawling around in some dark basement full of spiders." Emily smiled despite herself. "Well, I hope this isn't too bad in comparison." "Nah," he said, turning back to his work. "Not bad at all." As he continued to tinker with the pipes, Emily leaned against the counter, her arms still crossed. She felt a strange energy in the air, something unspoken, yet undeniable. It wasn't just the way Jake moved or the sound of his voice. It was the way he carried himself, as if he belonged here, as if he wasn't just passing through her home, but had become part of it. When he stood up to grab a wrench from his bag, their eyes met briefly, and Emily felt a flutter in her chest. It was ridiculous, she told herself. Absolutely ridiculous. Yet she couldn't deny the heat creeping up her neck, or the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at her again. "So, is it just you at home?" Jake asked casually, his tone light. Emily hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Yeah," she said finally. "My husband's at work." Jake nodded, returning to his task. "Busy guy, huh?" "Yeah," she said again, her voice softer this time. "Always busy." Jake didn't press further, but his silence seemed to say more than words could. Emily found herself wishing he would say something, anything, to break the tension that hung in the air, but he stayed focused on the sink, his movements steady and deliberate. After what felt like an eternity, Jake straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "All done," he said, flashing her another smile. "You're good to go." Emily forced herself to return his smile. "Thanks, I really appreciate it." "No problem." He packed up his tools, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "If anything else comes up, don't hesitate to call." Emily nodded, following him to the door. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Take care, Emily." "You too?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She closed the door behind him, leaning against it as her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the sink. Jake drives away, leaving Emily standing in the doorway, watching his truck disappear down the street. She feels a strange emptiness settle over her, but also something new, a spark she hadn't felt in years. The sound of Jake's truck rumbling away lingered in Emily's ears as she stood by the door, hand still resting on the doorknob. She stared down the street, the dull ache of an unspoken goodbye settling in her chest. Her pulse thrummed, echoing the heat that had risen in her face when he smiled at her. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. Not with a stranger, and certainly not with the plumber. "Oh." Emily shook her head, pushing away the thoughts crowding her mind. "Stop it," she muttered under her breath, closing the door and heading back into the kitchen. The sink was spotless now, the water draining perfectly. She twisted the faucet on and off, marveling at how simple it was, functional, unremarkable. Yet it was impossible to look at the sink without picturing Jake crouched beneath it, his hands working with such quiet confidence. The rest of the afternoon stretched out before her like a desert of monotony. Emily tried to busy herself, folding laundry, flipping through channels on the TV, but everything felt colorless. Her mind kept drifting back to the way Jake had leaned against the counter, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to burn through the small talk. "Why can't I get this out of my head?" she whispered, dropping the remote onto the couch. She glanced at the clock. Adam wouldn't be home for hours. He'd probably come in late, tired, and uninterested in hearing about her day. It wasn't his fault, she told herself. It was just the rhythm of their life now. But knowing that didn't make the ache in her chest any less potent. By evening, the house felt heavier than ever. She reheated leftovers for dinner, leaving Adam's plate covered with foil on the counter. When he finally came home, he barely looked at her before grabbing his plate and retreating to the den. "Thanks for dinner," he called out, his voice muffled through the walls. Emily sighed, her appetite vanishing. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the flickering candle she'd lit in an attempt to create some semblance of warmth. Her thoughts drifted back to Jake. The way he'd filled the room with his easy charm, the way he'd made her feel seen. For the first time in years, she hadn't felt invisible. The memory of his voice lingered in her mind. "If anything else comes up, don't hesitate to call." The words replayed over and over, each repetition making her pulse quicken. She glanced at her phone sitting on the counter. It would be absurd to call him, completely inappropriate, but still. Before she could talk herself out of it, Emily grabbed her phone and opened her contacts. His number was there, neatly saved under Jake. Plumber. Her thumb hovered over the call button, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what she'd even say. Maybe she'd invent a new problem, something trivial, a leaky faucet, a loose handle, anything to hear his voice again. "No," she muttered, setting the phone down with a thud. She drained her glass of wine and stood, resolving to put the entire incident out of her mind. This wasn't who she was. She loved Adam, even if their marriage wasn't what it used to be. A harmless crush on the plumber wasn't worth risking everything. The next morning, Emily woke up feeling groggy and restless. The sunlight streaming through the blinds seemed to mock her, highlighting every dull corner of her home. Adam had left early for work, as usual, his absence a predictable void. She padded into the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee and scrolling mindlessly through her phone. Her thumb froze when she saw a notification from Jake's Plumbing Company, a generic message thanking customers for their business and reminding them to leave a review. She stared at it, her coffee forgotten, her heart beating faster than it should for something so trivial. Without thinking, she opened the message and hit reply. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. What was she doing? It was just a text, she reasoned, completely harmless. "Hi, Jake. Thanks for fixing the sink yesterday. It's working perfectly." She hit send before she could change her mind, the message disappearing into the digital void. Immediately she regretted it. He probably wouldn't even reply. It was just a professional message, not an invitation for conversation. But a tiny part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, hoped he would respond. Her phone buzzed less than a minute later. She snatched it up, her stomach flipping as she read the reply. "Hey, Emily. Glad to hear it. Let me know if you need anything else." There it was again, that same open-ended offer, so innocuous yet loaded with possibility. Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, 100 potential replies swirling in her mind. She needed to shut this down before it spiraled into something she couldn't control. But instead she typed, "Actually, there is one more thing." By the time Jake's truck pulled into her driveway, Emily's nerves were frayed. She opened the door before he could knock, her heart racing as she tried to maintain a casual demeanor. "Hey," Jake said, his smile easy as he stepped inside. "What's the problem this time?" "Oh, it's just "The bathroom faucet," Emily lied, her voice shaky. "It's been dripping." Jake nodded, following her down the hall to the bathroom. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears as she led him into the small space. She leaned against the door frame, watching as he knelt to inspect the faucet. "You're saving me again," she said, trying to sound light-hearted. Jake glanced up at her, his hazel eyes locking onto hers. "Happy to help," he said, his voice low. "Any excuse to come back." Emily's breath caught in her throat. There it was, that unspoken tension, crackling between them like a live wire. She felt her cheeks flush, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the door frame. Jake straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Looks like it just needed a little tightening," he said, his tone casual, as if nothing had happened. But his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, the air between them heavy with words unsaid. Emily swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Thanks. I don't know what I'd do without you." Jake's smile widened, his eyes never leaving hers. "Well," he said softly, "I'm just a call away." He turned and headed back down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Emily followed him to the door, her heart hammering in her chest. As he stepped onto the porch, he glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Take care, Emily," he said, his voice tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "You too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched him drive away, the emptiness in her chest returning. But this time, it wasn't just loneliness. It was longing. Emily stood in the doorway, her hand clutching the doorframe. She glanced down at her phone, Jake's number still open on the screen. One message, one call, that was all it would take to change everything. The days that followed were both a blur and an eternity for Emily. Jake's presence lingered in her mind, a shadow she couldn't shake. Every mundane chore, folding laundry, wiping the counters, even brushing her hair, seemed to conjure flashes of his warm hazel eyes, his confident smile, and the casual way he said, "Any excuse to come back." Adam's absence was more pronounced now, not because he was home less than usual, but because Emily had become hyper-aware of the void he left behind. When she looked at him across the dinner table, it was as if he were a stranger. The warmth she used to feel in his presence was gone, replaced by a hollow ache she didn't know how to fill. Even when he kissed her goodnight, his lips brushing hers in a routine, automatic way, she felt nothing. But thinking about Jake, that was different. When she thought of him, her pulse quickened, her skin tingled, and she felt alive in a way she hadn't for years. By Friday, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She'd been telling herself all week that she wouldn't call him again, wouldn't text, wouldn't invite him back. But the more she tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. She convinced herself it wasn't about Jake. It was about the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, a perfectly valid reason to reach out. At least, that's what she told herself. Her fingers moved almost of their own accord, tapping out a message before her rational mind could intervene. "Hey, Jake, I hate to bother you again, but there's a leak in the guest bathroom. Any chance you could stop by to take a look?" The reply came almost instantly. "Of course. What time works for you?" Emily's hands trembled as she typed her response. She didn't bother pretending she was busy. "Any time today is fine. I'm home all day." Less than an hour later, Jake's truck pulled into the driveway. Emily watched from the living room window, her stomach twisting in nervous anticipation. She smoothed her hands over her jeans, checked her reflection in the mirror, and told herself, again, that this was nothing. He was here to fix the faucet, nothing more. But when she opened the door, all her carefully constructed rationalizations crumbled. Jake stood on the porch, tool bag slung over one shoulder, his smile warm and disarming. His t-shirt clung to him in the late afternoon heat, and his hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd been running his hands through it on the drive over. "Hey," he said, his voice low and easy. "Where's the problem this time?" Emily stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "It's in the guest bathroom," she said, her voice wavering despite her best effort to sound calm. Jake followed her down the hallway, his footsteps steady and unhurried. The guest bathroom was small, with pale blue walls and a white pedestal sink. Emily hovered near the doorway as Jake set down his tool bag and crouched in front of the sink. "It's a slow leak," she said, twisting her hands together. "Not a big deal, but I figured it should be fixed before it gets worse." Jake glanced up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good call," he said. "Leaks have a way of sneaking up on you if you don't take care of them." Emily nodded, unsure how to respond. The air in the small bathroom felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged outright, but both seemed acutely aware of. She leaned against the door frame, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched him work. "So," Jake said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence, "do you usually spend your days fixing up the house?" Emily laughed softly, the sound nervous. "Not really. Uh, Honestly, I'm not great at this kind of stuff. That's why I keep calling you." Jake looked up at her again, his hazel eyes catching the light in a way that made her breath hitch. "I don't mind," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You can call me any time." Emily felt her cheeks flush. She dropped her gaze, pretending to inspect the floor tiles. "Thanks," she murmured. "I appreciate that." Jake turned back to the sink, but the air between them remained heavy with tension. Emily couldn't tell if she was imagining it, or if Jake felt it too. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, every glance charged with meaning. She tried to focus on something else, anything else, but her thoughts kept circling back to him. When he finally stood, his work finished, Jake wiped his hands on a rag and turned to her with a smile. "All set," he said. "Shouldn't give you any more trouble." Emily forced herself to smile back. "You're a lifesaver," she said, her voice softer than she intended. Jake's smile widened. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "Emily," he said, his tone serious now, "I just want to say, if there's ever anything you need, you can count on me. Not just for plumbing, but anything." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she just nodded, her heart racing. Jake reached for his tool bag, slinging it over his shoulder. "Well," he said, his voice lighter now, "I guess I'll get out of your hair. Let me know if that sink gives you any trouble." He moved past her, his arm brushing hers as he stepped into the hallway. The brief contact sent a jolt through Emily, her skin tingling where he'd touched her. She followed him to the front door, her pulse pounding in her ears. Jake paused on the porch, turning back to her one last time. "Take care, Emily," he said, his voice low and warm. "You too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As he walked to his truck, Emily watched him go, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. She knew she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't take back. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to look away. Back inside, Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. Jake's number was still open in her messages, his words echoing in her mind. "You can call me any time." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Finally, she typed a single message. "Thank you for everything today. You've been amazing." The reply came seconds later. "Any time, Emily, really." Emily's heart raced as she stared at the screen. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't seem to stop. The hours after Jake left passed in a haze. Emily moved through her house as if on autopilot, folding laundry, tidying up, and half-heartedly flipping through the channels on TV. None of it could distract her from the electric tension that still buzzed under her skin. She'd replayed the moment at the door a dozen times, the way Jake had looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he said, "Take care, Emily." It was innocent, she told herself. A kind plumber doing his job, nothing more. But her heart betrayed her every time she thought of his hazel eyes locking onto hers, or the way his hand had brushed against her arm. The truth gnawed at her, relentless and undeniable. She didn't want it to be innocent, not anymore. The following morning, Emily woke to find a light rain tapping against the windows. It was Adam's day off, but as usual, he was already holed up in his home office. She made herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the gray sky. The house felt colder, emptier than usual, despite Adam being just a few rooms away. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. She grabbed it, her pulse quickening when she saw Jake's name on the screen. "Morning, Emily. Just wanted to check in. Everything holding up okay with the bathroom sink?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. There was no reason to respond. Everything was fine, but her heart raced at the idea of continuing the conversation. She tapped out a reply before she could think better of it. "Hi, Jake. Yes, everything's working perfectly. Thank you again." His response came almost immediately. "Glad to hear it. Hope you're having a good morning." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she should leave it there, but the warmth in Jake's words was like a balm to the loneliness that had been weighing her down for years. Against her better judgment, she typed back, "Trying to. It's a quiet morning. You?" Jake's reply was slower this time, but when it came, it made her stomach flip. "Wish I could say the same. I just finished up a job nearby. Too bad I'm not on call for quiet mornings. Those are my favorite." Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Was he flirting? Or was she just reading too much into it? Her fingers hesitated before typing. But a spark of boldness pushed her forward. "Quiet mornings are better when you have someone to share them with." Her hands trembled as she hit send. The reply came quickly, and when she read it, her breath caught in her throat. "Couldn't agree more." The day dragged on, each passing hour thick with anticipation and self-doubt. Emily tried to bury herself in housework, hoping to smother the thoughts swirling in her mind, but nothing helped. Every time she glanced at her phone, she half expected another message from Jake, despite knowing the ball was in her court now. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. Adam had stepped out to run errands, leaving her alone in the house. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled fresh and damp. Emily stood by the kitchen sink, her phone clutched in her hand, debating her next move. Before she could talk herself out of it, she opened Jake's contact and typed a message. "Are you still nearby?" His response came almost instantly. "Just finished a job a couple streets over. Why?" Emily hesitated for only a moment before replying. "The faucet in the kitchen is acting up again. Would you mind stopping by to take a look?" She hit send, her heart racing. It wasn't true. There was nothing wrong with the kitchen faucet. But the lie rolled off her fingers so easily it scared her. Moments later, her phone buzzed. On my way. Jake arrived 15 minutes later, his truck pulling into the driveway with the same steady rumble that Emily had come to associate with him. She opened the door before he could knock, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hey," he said, smiling as he stepped inside. "Kitchen faucet this time, huh?" Emily nodded, her throat dry. "Yeah, it's been acting strange." Jake set his tool bag on the counter and crouched in front of the sink, his movements calm and deliberate. Emily hovered nearby, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched him work. The silence between them was heavy, charged with an energy that neither seemed willing to acknowledge outright. Finally, Jake straightened and turned to face her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Well," he said, his voice low, "I hate to break it to you, but there's nothing wrong with this faucet." Emily's cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Jake's smile softened as he stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Emily," he said, his tone serious now, "what's really going on?" Her pulse thundered in her ears as she met his gaze. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to see you again." The confession hung in the air between them, weighty and unspoken. Jake's eyes searched hers, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Emily thought he might turn and walk away, leaving her to drown in the shame of her own vulnerability. But instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. The touch sent a jolt through her, her skin tingling where his hand lingered. "You don't have to make excuses," Jake said softly. "If you want me here, just say so." Emily's breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she nodded instead, the gesture small but unmistakable. Jake stepped closer, his hand sliding down her arm to take her hand in his. "You sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded again, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm sure," she whispered. Jake's lips curved into a small, almost hesitant smile before he leaned in, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, a question more than an answer. But when Emily kissed him back, the hesitation melted away, replaced by a heat that burned through every layer of doubt and fear she'd been carrying. For the first time in years, she felt alive. As Jake pulled back, his hand still resting on her cheek, Emily's phone buzzed on the counter. The sound shattered the moment like glass, and she froze, her heart plummeting as she realized it was Adam's name flashing on the screen. Emily's breath caught as her phone buzzed again, Adam's name glowing on the screen. She froze, her heart pounding against her ribs, as guilt and panic surged through her veins. Jake stepped back, his hand slipping from her cheek, his hazel eyes scanning her face. "You should probably get that," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with understanding. Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she grabbed the phone. She hesitated before answering, her voice faltering. "Hello?" "Hey," Adam's voice crackled through the speaker. "Just checking in. I'll be home in about an hour. Did you need anything?" "No," Emily said quickly, her voice higher than usual. "Everything's fine." "All right," Adam said, his tone distracted. "See you soon." The call ended, leaving Emily standing in the middle of the kitchen, her pulse racing. She set the phone down, avoiding Jake's gaze. The room felt heavier now, as if the weight of her actions had suddenly become unbearable. "Emily," Jake said softly, his voice pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. "You okay?" She looked up at him, her chest tightening. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't know what I'm doing." Jake stepped closer, his gaze steady. "It's okay to feel that way, but whatever this is, whatever's happening between us, it's your choice." Emily swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. "I've been so lonely," she whispered. "For so long. Adam doesn't see me anymore. I don't even think he cares." Jake reached out, his hand brushing hers. "I see you, Emily," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I care." His words hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over the fragile barriers she'd built around her heart. For a moment, she wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into the warmth and safety he offered. But the reality of her situation loomed large, unshakable. "I need some time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here if you want to talk, or if you don't." Emily managed a faint smile, her chest aching with the weight of unspoken words. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. Jake lingered for a moment, as if considering whether to say more, but he simply nodded and turned, grabbing his tool bag and heading for the door. Emily followed him, her heart sinking with each step. As he stepped onto the porch, he glanced back at her one last time. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said, his voice gentle. "You too," she replied, her throat tight. She closed the door behind him, leaning against it as tears spilled down her cheeks. She wanted to blame Jake, to blame Adam, to blame anyone but herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was her mess, her choices, her consequences. Adam arrived home an hour later, his usual air of exhaustion clinging to him. He kissed Emily on the cheek and muttered something about a long day before retreating to the den. She watched him go, her chest tightening with a mix of frustration and guilt. How had they ended up here? Living parallel lives under the same roof, each unaware of the other's pain. Emily busied herself with mundane tasks, hoping to push away the gnawing thoughts in her mind. She loaded the dishwasher, wiped down the counters, and tried to focus on the hum of the appliances instead of the ache in her chest. But when she glanced at her phone and saw Jake's name in her recent messages, the memories came rushing back. She tapped the screen, opening their last conversation. His words stared back at her. "You can call me any time." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing with what she wanted to say versus what she knew she should say. Finally, she typed, "Thank you for being there today. I needed that more than you know." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, her heart pounding as she waited for a reply. It came minutes later. "Always, Emily, anytime you need me." The next morning, Emily woke to the sound of Adam moving around the kitchen. It was rare for him to be up before her, let alone making breakfast. She padded down the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and found him pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Morning," he said, glancing up at her. "Thought I'd make us breakfast for a change." Emily blinked, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Adam said, his tone unusually soft. He handed her a mug, his eyes searching hers. "We haven't spent much time together lately. I thought maybe we could catch up." Emily's heart twisted. She wanted to feel something. Relief, gratitude, affection. But all she felt was a dull ache. She forced a smile and nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them less strained than usual, but still heavy. Adam asked about her day, her plans, even the housework she'd been doing. It was more attention than he'd given her in months, but it felt hollow, as if he were checking off a box rather than truly engaging with her. When he left for work, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions. His effort, however small, should have meant something, but instead of closing the distance between them, it only highlighted how far apart they'd grown. That afternoon, as Emily cleaned the guest bathroom, she found herself staring at the sink Jake had fixed. She traced her fingers along the edge of the countertop, her mind replaying the moment when his hand had brushed hers, the way he'd looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he said, "I see you." Her phone buzzed in the other room, pulling her from her thoughts. She grabbed it from the counter and froze when she saw Adam's name flashing on the screen. Her stomach twisted as she answered. "Hi," she said, her voice uncertain. "Hey," Adam said, his tone neutral. "Just got a weird email. Did you have the plumber back here yesterday?" Emily's blood ran cold. "Why?" she asked, her voice faltering. "There's a charge on the credit card," Adam said. "From Jake's Plumbing. Thought we already paid him for the sink in the kitchen." Emily's mind raced, her thoughts tangling in a web of panic. "Oh, she said quickly, forcing a laugh. "Yeah, I forgot to mention, there was a problem with the bathroom faucet, so I called him back." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You didn't say anything about that last night," Adam said, his tone suspicious. "It wasn't a big deal," Emily said, her heart pounding. "I didn't want to bother you with it." Adam's silence stretched, heavy and foreboding. "All right," he said finally, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "I'll see you tonight." The call ended, leaving Emily standing in the middle of the kitchen, her chest tight with panic. She set the phone down, her hands trembling. Adam's doubt was clear, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in her story started to show. That evening, Adam came home earlier than usual, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. Emily's heart sank as she realized the walls she'd built to protect her secret were starting to crumble. Emily's heart pounded as Adam's words settled between them. "We need to talk." He stood in the kitchen doorway, his hands in his pockets, but his eyes betrayed a sharper intensity. The quiet weight of his tone sent chills down her spine. "About what?" she asked, her voice shaky as she clutched the dish towel for grounding. Adam didn't move closer, but leaned against the counter, his eyes never leaving hers. "The plumber. Jake, right?" Her stomach flipped, the sound of his name hitting her like a punch. "What about him?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. Adam exhaled, his tone even but heavy. "I called his company today. Wanted to check the charges on the card. Turns out you had him here twice this week. Why?" Emily's mind scrambled for an explanation. I forgot to tell you, the bathroom faucet was leaking again, and then—" "The kitchen wasn't leaking," Adam interrupted, his voice rising. "You said everything was fine." She froze, her face flushed as the lie fell apart in front of her. Adam straightened, his arms crossing over his chest. "You've been distant, Emily, for months. And now this? A plumber you called twice but didn't tell me about?" Her defenses rose instinctively. "Why are you interrogating me about this?" she shot back, her voice tight, though her hands trembled. "Because something doesn't feel right," Adam said, his voice quieter, but no less firm. I may have been distracted, but I'm not blind. You're hiding something. I can feel it. Tears pricked at Emily's eyes, but she bit them back. You're the one who's been distant, she said, her voice trembling. You barely even see me anymore. Adam's expression softened, but only slightly. I know I've been focused on work, he admitted. But is this about Jake? Did something happen with him? Her breath caught, and she dropped her gaze to the floor. She could feel Adam watching her, waiting, the silence between them thick with everything she couldn't say. Finally, she shook her head. Nothing happened. It was a weak denial, and Adam's sharp inhale told her he didn't believe it. But he didn't press further. Instead, he sighed and stepped back. If nothing happened, then prove it. Tell me the truth before I find out another way. Emily looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. She couldn't say more. Didn't dare to. Adam stared at her, his jaw tight. He nodded slowly, his silence speaking louder than words. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Emily standing alone, the weight of her choices pressing down like a storm she couldn't escape. Emily stood by the window long after Adam left, staring out at the empty street. Her phone buzzed and she glanced down to see Jake's name. For a moment, she hovered over the screen before placing it face down, her heart and mind consumed with doubt and regret.